Hi there, I'm Angela. Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad that you're here. And if you're a regular, thanks for coming back. In today's video, I'm going to continue talking about how I plan my veggie garden each year. So this is part two in what might end up being a 2 or maybe 3-part series. It depends on how much we cover today. If you haven't seen the first one, I suggest that maybe you go back and look at that one. It's not absolutely necessary because the videos aren't intended to be in sequential order. In fact, depending on the gardener, you might decide that you want to look at what seeds you have and what you want to grow. That might be your starting point. Whereas other gardeners might look at their space and decide what to grow based on their space. So there's different approaches on what you choose to look at first. And in that previous video, I did talk about how I choose what I'm going to grow each year and some tips on how to decide what things to put in your veggie garden. And we also looked at my very detailed method for logging everything that I grow and harvest and everything like that. In today's video, we're going to look at the layout of my garden and why it's laid out the way that it is and how I chose what goes where. So stay tuned. And just ask that you keep in mind, this is not meant to be a comprehensive gardening resource. I'm showing you how I do things and what's worked for me, because oftentimes I find that the best ways that we learn about gardening is from other gardeners. So hopefully you'll find this helpful. So with that in mind, let's get into some of the factors to consider when deciding where to grow the veggies that you're going to grow. One of the most important factors to consider when deciding where to situate your veggie garden is the amount of sunlight that the space gets. This is hugely important because while many factors can be changed, the amount of sunlight that the space gets can't be changed. So we as planet Earth are pretty much locked into our orientation and orbit around the sun, and there's no getting around that. There are some things that can be done as far as if there are structures blocking the sunlight, maybe you could reposition those, but oftentimes it could be that it's your house that's blocking the sun and you can't change that. So you would want to look at positioning the garden where it's going to get the most sunlight. Most of the vegetables that we love to grow as home gardeners, such as tomatoes and peppers, need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight every day. Preferably 6 to 8, and even more is not harmful. So keep that in mind. And when we look at the diagram of my garden layout, I'll kind of show you how I kept that factor in mind when deciding where to place the garden beds, and then within that, what beds to plant what veggies in, so to maximize the amount of direct sunlight that they receive. There are some veggies that can get by with lesser amounts of sunlight, such as your leafy greens, but most of us want to grow more than just leafy greens, and we're going to need that sunlight. So keep that in mind, and like I said, I'll show you my own example of that. Maybe that'll be helpful for you. So another factor to keep in mind is the actual points of the compass. So the best sunlight that your garden could get would come from the south, and if you could face your garden pointing towards the south, that would be best. And if you can't do that, if you could give it an east or a west exposure, that would be second best. The northern exposure is not going to be as beneficial for your garden. And once again, I'll show you how that played into my positioning of my own garden, so that it may be helpful once you see the illustration. Also, keeping in mind the compass points, that comes into play when deciding which individual plants go where in your garden. So for instance, you would want the plants that are going to get really tall or climb up high on a trellis to be placed in the back of the garden, like on the north side of the garden. That way they're not shading out the sun from any smaller plants. So the smaller plants would be in the front of the garden. Other factors to consider when deciding where to situate your garden are proximity to water, It's very handy if you can locate your garden near a water outlet or water spigot. Otherwise, you might be schlepping around a lot of water. I experienced that when I decided to grow some apple trees a few years back. They were really far from the house, and toting those buckets of water hundreds of feet was not fun at all, even in a cart, because the water would slosh out. So if you can situate your garden close to your house, presumably you're going to have a water outlet on the side of your house, that would be best. And also, situating the garden close to your house means that you're probably going to be more likely to check on the garden, be out there every day tending to it, weeding it, checking for pests. So another thing to keep in mind is just proximity to where you spend most of your time. Another factor is your ability to keep the garden site protected, primarily from invading critters such as bunnies, deer, squirrel, and other wildlife. That might factor in pretty heavily. And a couple of other factors to consider, but these are maybe more easily changed, are the quality of the soil. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world if, say, you've picked out the perfect site. It has good water access, it's very close to the house, it gets great sunlight, but the soil is terrible. So soil can be amended, and also you can use things such as containers and raised beds and get as great quality of soil as you're willing to put the effort and money into. If you're going to be growing directly in ground, another thing to keep in mind is whether that site is graded or sloped in any way. So that could play a role in how well things grow. So have I missed anything? I think I covered all the major factors to consider when you're deciding where to grow your garden. But if I missed anything, let me know in the comments. I'd appreciate that. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the layout of my own garden, and I can walk you through the process that I went through when deciding that I was going to put my garden in that particular space, and how it's evolved over the years, and factors that I kept in mind when adding every new element into the garden. Stay tuned. What we're looking at here is a graph layout that I drew on actual paper with a pencil a couple of years ago of my own veggie garden space, and I've just reused that same graph every year since then, since that couple of years ago, and just trace over it. And this is actually one that I used last year, and I actually haven't updated it for this year yet, but it won't change too much. You can see that for RB stands for raised bed, so raised bed 7 and raised bed 8. We built raised bed 7 last year, and raised bed 8 is the one that I'm planning to add in 2022. So I just made that note on last year's graph paper, and I don't really think that there will be too much else to change on it this year. I might change the location of some of these grow bags, but I'll get into all these different components, and that'll come into play in a little bit. And it's not perfectly to scale. I just tried to do it as best as I could. It's good enough. It definitely is representational, so it works. So some of the key, let's look at the actual hard structures first, the things that will not change, although that is actually most of this, other than the grow bags and maybe the potting bench. So we've got the house. So this is the side of our house, and our shed, pretty massive structures there, and then the greenhouse that we just added last year. And just for reference, this is the compass points here. So this is the north direction, and the sun comes up over here, and then of course south down in this corner, and west right here. So the way that our property is situated, when we bought the shed wasn't here yet, nor was the greenhouse, and this whole garden space was actually scrubby, weedy brush. So after we were here for a couple years and I had evaluated where the best place for my veggie garden would be, it turned out to be on this side of the house here, for a couple of reasons. One, we have a water outlet that I didn't draw in, but it's right here. And two, on the other side of the house, which would be over here, is where we park our cars. And then in the front of the house, which is down here, that's actually, there's a bunch of trees there and there's a sidewalk. It's kind of like our front yard. And then along the back side of the house, it's very heavily wooded. So that's what these little squiggly things are, trees. So this was really the only option as far as getting a garden situated close to the house. So after, taking a couple years to assess that and just growing veggies in containers on our deck, we went ahead and had this space cleared out. And ever since then, I've been adding raised beds, not every year, but most years. So this year we'll be up to raised bed number 8. And there's still going to be room to squeeze in a couple here and there, but I'm kind of maxing out my space here. And if I want to expand any further, I might have to look at some areas farther away from the house. But let's get back to those compass points and the sun. The sun is so hugely important when it comes to a veggie garden. So for our space, the sun comes up over here in the east, of course, and it makes a trajectory in this diagonal to the house, a line that's diagonal to the house towards the west down here. Pardon my little rudimentary graphics there, but just to show you the path of the sun. And because that's the path of the sun and the house is here, the house does shade out a lot of this space right up against the house quite a bit. In fact, this area here gets the least amount of sun in the whole veggie garden. And all of it does eventually get some sun, but it's pretty late in the day by the time these ends of raised bed 5 and 6 actually receive any sun. So that plays a huge factor in what I decide to grow in these 2 beds, just because it's so shaded here up against the house. And knowing that, I tend to put my leafy greens in these spaces because they don't need quite as much sun. The rest of the garden does get plenty enough sun to grow tomatoes, peppers, and the greenhouse will get sun all day long in the summertime. And what I have found, though, when I've had grow bags back here closer to these woods, and over here, this is that north side, they get shaded out by the trees and they're facing the north. They're not getting as much direct sun. So that didn't bode too well for my tomatoes last year. So I think I'm going to move these grow bags out closer to the front of the garden here where it'll get more sun. And another thing that this whole layout influenced me on is that a couple of years back we put a really tall 7-foot trellis in raised bed number 4, and it made perfect sense to put the trellis there at that time because it was in the back and it wouldn't, anything growing up on that trellis would not shade out any. Let me back up. So all the smaller or shorter plants were planted in the front so that trellis would not overshadow them. So all of this just kind of really has influenced what I grow where. The biggest things being what goes in the back here next to the woods and the northern exposure, and what goes up against the house, just because the house makes such a shadow against the sun. So I hope you found that helpful, and I think we'll go ahead and stop here for today. And there will be at least one more video in this planning series where I'll talk about how to plan quantities, and as far as spacing, and how for each of my garden beds I determine how much of what can go in there. So I hope you'll tune back in for that. And until next time, this is Angela signing off with a friendly reminder to get out there and play in the dirt. Bye.